There's an often overlooked part of reverb that instantly tricks your brain into hearing depth. Early reflections are the reason some mixers sound massive, while other mixers sound a bit flat. So I'm going to show you how to harness early reflections to move sounds forward or back, and finally break out of that two-dimensional mixing trap. In this video, I'm going to show you how early reflections control depth placement, how they define the size of a room, and how you can use them to place sounds near, mid, or far in a mix. When a sound is created in a room, it doesn't reach our ears all at once. It arrives in stages. First we hear the direct sound, then we hear the first reflections bouncing off the nearby surfaces. After that, we hear thousands of reflections blending together into what we recognise as reverb. Those first reflections are what we call early reflections. They tell our brain how close the walls are, how large the space is, and where the sound source sits inside it. The later dense reflections form the reverb tail, which tells us how reflective or how live the space is. A simple way to think about it: early reflections define the room. The tail reveals how live or expansive that room feels. Our brain judges distance using 3 cues: the direct sound, the early reflections, and then the late reflections. The late reflections are often referred to as reverb. These reflections are in their many hundreds or thousands, if not more, and they combine to give us that continuous sense of reverb. And then that reverb decays slowly over time. When early reflections are strong and arrive quickly, the sound feels closer to nearby surfaces and therefore closer to us. When they soften and the late reflections or the tail dominates, the sound feels further inside that environment. Depending on how those reflections behave over time, that's what gives us a sense of depth. We're often told to use EQ and volume to help push sounds back into the soundstage, but often the missing piece is early reflections, and that's what I wanted to talk about today. For this demonstration, I'm using a room algorithm in Valhalla Room. I've chosen Valhalla Room because it's very well priced, it's affordable, it's excellent, and it's widely used, rather than choosing a reverb that's just particular to Pro Tools, for example. So that's why I've picked that particular plugin. Room reverbs are especially useful for hearing early reflections because the reflections arrive quickly from nearby surfaces, and that makes the boundaries of the space obvious to our ears. In a hall, the reflections are spaced further apart, and the tail becomes more dominant, so you perceive scale rather than the nearby walls. Plate reverbs don't represent a typical space or a room at all. They produce a dense, smooth decay with very little directional reflection information included, which gives us sheen and sustain rather than clear spatial boundaries. Let me just give you 3 or 4 quick examples of what I'm going to show you in this video. This is a basic mix of drums, bass, acoustic guitar, and electric guitars. There's no vocals in this. I just want to keep it easy for you to hear. The first mix that I've got for you to listen to is where the acoustic has no reverb on it whatsoever. The acoustic is a mono track, which you can just see here. So reverb is playing 2 roles in this mix. It's going to give it more of a stereo feel, as well as positioning it in the soundstage. So the first mix that I've got is the dry mix, where there's no reverb whatsoever on the acoustic. In fact, there's no reverb on anything other than the drums. The next mix will be the near room, so the acoustic will have some stereo information now, and whilst that'll make it feel as though it's in a room, it will keep the acoustic fairly sort of upfront in the mix. The next is a mid-room, where I've used different early reflection settings to push it push it back a little bit in the mix. And then the final one is the far room, where I've used different early reflection settings again to push it even farther back. Now these examples, they're not perfect. They are exaggerated so that I hopefully can get you to hear the different tonal qualities of these spaces and the sense of the room or the size of the room and where the guitar is within that room because of the early reflections. There are no late reflections here in these mixes. I just muted them all together. It's just literally those early reflections that come to our ears first from the closest surfaces. Okay, and that's what gives us the information. That's what gives us that localization and sense of depth in a mix. Okay, let's get on with it. I'm going to play through these mixes and just flick through the different playlists here so that you can hear the changes. So we'll start with the dry, first of all, with the mono acoustic, and then I'll slowly step through the other mixes. Okay, so how did I create those 3 different levels? Let me show you. A great plugin for me just to use to give you a visual representation of early reflections versus reverb or late reflections is Reverb. What this plugin does, and what many plugins do, are separate the early reflections from the reverb or the tail. I'm going to use words 3 phrases, and they're all interchangeable. That's going to be late reflections, reverb, and tail. And so I'm going to be mixing those up, but they all basically refer to the wash of sound, those continuous reflections that typically are what we would call reverb. Okay, so I hope that makes things a bit clearer. So this is a whole algorithm. We've got the reverb tail shown there, or the late reflections shown there. And then we've got the early reflections of these sticks, okay, that you can set the amplitude of. In a whole, if you think about those early reflections, those reflections you can see are spaced out quite far apart from each other. Whereas if we were to go to a room, they are not quite so spaced out. And then they also decrease in amplitude as well. So it goes a long way to telling you why a hall sounds like a hall and why a room sounds like a room. Early reflections and reverb are usually linked, and many reverbs will actually, rather than having separate controls like Reverb does, many have just got the one slider, and one side will be all early reflections and the other side will be all late reflections or reverb, and then they slowly kind of blend together as you move that slider. Okay, I don't want to get too into the weeds of that. I just want to keep this really straightforward. So what I've done in those examples was basically I turned the reverb off. So all you were hearing in those mixes were just the early reflections. If you change the size of the room, you can see obviously those early reflections get closer and closer together. Okay, makes complete sense. In a smaller room, the reflections would be closer together. So I hope that just gives you a little bit of a visual idea of what's going on when I'm talking about early reflections and reverb, and what happens when you change the size of the room. What I also quickly want to touch on is pre-delay. I'm sure many of you are aware of pre-delay in reverbs. So you add pre-delay, and what it does is it just pushes the reverb further in time and separates it from the direct sound so that you can basically retain more clarity in the original recording, in the source sound. Some reverbs only push the tail. Other reverbs push both the early reflections and the tail. So it really does depend on the reverb that you've got as to what that pre-delay parameter is affecting. I used Valhalla Room though, so that doesn't have quite such a nice or explanatory graphical interface for me to explain that. And this can be a stumbling block for many beginners, the terminology around the different plugins. It really does, you've got to read the manual. But now you know what you're looking for, early reflections and late reflections. In this plugin, you can see that here, early and late, and you can adjust each one independently. For this demonstration, I'm using the large room algorithm. The depth is at 0% because the depth in this particular plugin is the equivalent to the reverb in the waves plugin, so the late reflections. So with that all the way to 0, that's why we're able to just hear the early reflections. There's a decay time set of 1.75 seconds, no pre-delay, and the size is represented here in milliseconds. And that was the parameter that increases or decreases the size of the room so that early reflections get wider or narrower, or longer or shorter in time. So this is the setting I used for the near sounding reverb. Let me solo the acoustic so you can hear that. So it does a great job of taking a mono source and putting it inside a room, which therefore gives it a sense of stereo width. What I want you to do though is listen to the early reflections. Try and pick out their tonal characteristics. These are what give you the sense of the room, the size of the room. So see if you can pick up on that. What can often help is to add pre-delay so that I'm adding that gap at the start, so that gap might help you separate the early reflections from the direct sound so you can hear them even clearer. See if that helps. So the settings that give us that quality of a smaller sounding room is the size here of 25 milliseconds. Anywhere up to about 50 milliseconds is just a small to medium sized room. I guess what you would think of perhaps studio or maybe a small hall, maybe. If you want to get bigger, more into a sense of a larger hall or a concert hall, then this is where we can do that. If I go to the mid reverb and let you hear that, also notice when I press stop, because there are no late reflections or reverb in this sound, it completely stops dead. Okay. Let me dial in a bit of pre-delay so that might help you distinguish the early reflections from the direct sound. So yeah, it does. It feels like a slightly bigger room. And that's again because we've just increased the size there, 55 milliseconds. So you want to be looking for parameters that say size or the parameter that moves the early reflections wider, further apart. What I've also done in this mid soundstage setting is I've used the high cut at 6K. This is another parameter that you use to create depth. By rolling off high frequencies, it does push the sound back in the soundstage. So that's a combination of early reflections and EQ to give that illusion. If we go back to the near reverb setting, I left it at 8K. What I'll do is just maybe if I put that up to give you some pre-delay there, maybe I can successfully go between the two reverbs there so you can hear the difference between the near and the mid. So I've got them both on screen there for you as well. The electric blue is the near reverb and the red is the mid. Start with the near reverb. Okay, so it's quite a subtle difference, but it's definitely detectable, the sense of size of the room between the two. Let's look at the settings for the far reverb then, and they are back to blue. And here I've changed the size of the room to 100 milliseconds. So this is getting to concert hall size. So let's take a listen to that. And with a bit of pre-delay to help you hear it. And if we go between the maybe the near and the far, which has the greatest difference. So here's the near, and then I'll switch over to the far. Okay, so it's really about the quality, the sense of size, and the location of the sound source in the room. And this is what we use to add depth or to create depth to instruments or vocals in a mix. So with early reflections, with EQ, and with actual level of the instrument in the mix, that's how you're able to create the different senses of depth and start building in that 3D soundstage that you've been perhaps been struggling to up until now. So what about the late reflections then? We apply reverb because we want to hear some reverb. At the moment, we're just hearing a room and some walls. And that's something I want to get across actually, is that early reflections really do give you a sense of the walls in the room, okay? So to add late reflections or reverb back into this preset or this setting is the depth control here. That slowly starts to decrease the amount of early reflections and increase the amount of late reflections. Let's take a listen to that. And then we get our familiar reverb tail. So the first step really is to consider whereabouts in the soundstage you want to place any particular sound source. If you want to place a sound source noticeably further back in the mix, then a room algorithm is going to be your best bet to do that, because there are more early reflections in a room algorithm than in a hall or a plate, as I mentioned earlier. And the parameter to go to is just to look for size or look for early reflections, depending on what plugin you're using. And you can set the size of the room, the walls of the room, the walls of the space, with just initially solo your early reflections and change the size of the room to get a sense of what feels right for your mix. And then you can start to add some late reflections in to really fill out the gaps. You know, in between those reflection points, we want to fill out the gaps with some late reflections, because that's how reverb works in real rooms, in real life. That's what feels natural to us. Let's listen to the acoustic with no late reflections in the near space, and then I'll start to add some late reflections and then maybe some pre-delay. And let's listen to that in the mix. Okay, so I hope that has given you some ideas to go to the parameters that really matter when it comes to adding depth to any sound source in a mix. Let's do the same thing with the other reverbs. So I quite like that. Let's set that to say 10 milliseconds. I didn't particularly like the 30 milliseconds on that example. Just felt a bit too detached from the reverb. And the idea is that I wanted to kind of just push it back. When you use, the more pre-delay you use, the more clear the sound remains, and therefore the more upfront it remains. So I'm just going to keep that pretty minimal there. And then let's do the same thing with the mid. High cut in place here though, we're knocking down some of the highs to make it feel a bit farther back. And then let's do the same then with the far, bring that down to about 10. And then the high cut is knocked down again even further down to 4 kilohertz. Let's take a listen to that acoustic in solo on the near. Then the mid. And then the far. With the far, I wouldn't use any pre-delay to push it even farther back in the soundstage. Versus the near, keeping it up front. With the far reverb, to push it back even further, yes, knock back the pre-delay, but also increase the decay time. So let's take that up to, I don't know, 2.5 seconds. Versus the mid. So you really play around with these parameters. And that's what I encourage you to do to further your learning on this and to build up your hearing and your listening skills, is to just stick with those parameters. Start with just the early reflections. Use the pre-delay to be able to separate that out away from the direct sound a little so that you can identify what the room early reflections actually sound like, the tonal characteristic of them, and the sense of size of room and depth placement within that room of that particular instrument. Then you can go to the late reflections and start to increase those and add those into the sound to fill in the spaces between those early reflections. And then play around with the decay time, the pre-delay, and with the high cut to really fine-tune where you place that sound source in your mix. A common mistake I see is people adding more reverb or more reverb tail when something feels too close. And often what's needed really is just the adjustment of the early reflections. That reverb tail just adds more wash, whereas early reflections add placement. So what should you be listening for when you are focusing in on these early reflections? You want to listen for how quickly the space appears. And that's why I use the pre-delay to kind of help you judge that, and I hope that helped. You also want to listen to how close the boundaries feel. Remember, early reflections is about the room, the walls, okay? How close do they feel? And how does the sound source feel inside that space? Does it feel solid? Does it feel anchored? Or does it feel as though it's kind of floating in mid-space? Once you start hearing this, depth becomes something that you can actually control rather than guess at or flick through presets. If this is making depth click in a way that is making sense to you, there's a waiting list below in the description for a depth and dimension workshop that I'm working on. If enough people sign up for it, I'll go ahead and build it. Okay, so if that feels like something you're interested in, get on the waiting list. That is an actual sign to me that you are interested in getting on that workshop to work with me and just go really deep into this stuff. Okay, hope you found this useful. Early reflections tell the brain where the walls are. That's the one thing I want you to take away from this. The reverb tail tells the brain how large or live the space is. Balance the two and you control depth from front to back. So now you've heard how early reflections place a sound and how the tail shapes the space around it. The next question is, which reverb should you choose to create that space? Because a room, a plate, and a hall don't just sound different, they position the listener in completely different environments. And that depends on the sound source. So in this next video, I break down the main reverb types and show you exactly when to use each one, so you can stop guessing and start choosing the space on purpose. That's all from me. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.